Hello, this is Greg Allison with Green Greg's, coming to you on the 5th day of August, 2021. Time on deck, 11:0900 hours Central Daylight Time. And today I bring you special guest, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. Dr. Peter Pry is the Executive Director of the National Task Force on Homeland Security for EMP especially. Is his specialty electromagnetic pulse. He is quite the dean of this topic and going out and speaking to people and getting people to understand it. Dr. Peter Pry is a weapons systems expert. He is also a historian, in addition to his great depth and knowledge on electromagnetic pulse and the threats that we face for that. And that gives him a lot of perspective on understanding the international scene, the international threats, the military threats from other nations in our world. Things I talk to you a lot about on this channel. So ladies and gentlemen, I bring you Dr. Peter Pry. Peter, what say you about where we're at today?
Well, where we are today, I think if you want to know exactly where we are today, go read Winston Churchill's magisterial book, The Gathering Storm, which is the first volume of his multi-volume history of World War II. And it basically describes the period in the 1930s when the Western political and military elites, almost all of them, except for Winston Churchill and a handful of experts who surrounded him and were his advisors, failed to see the looming threat from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. If you read that book, I think it really, and just think about where we are today, it tells you where we are today. There are so many parallels between where we are now and where we were then, beginning with a loss of confidence in themselves by the Western democracies. In the aftermath of World War I and then with the Great Depression, most of the Western democracies, had really thought that free enterprise and free political systems, maybe they didn't work. People weren't blaming Germany anymore for World War I, but they were blaming the West. They were blaming themselves. There were books like The Merchants of Death written that said, it really wasn't Germany's fault that we had World War I. It was the capitalism and imperialism and the wealthy industrialists who wanted. There was a conspiracy theory about how World War I started, that it was really because wealthy industrialists wanted the war so that they could sell munitions and make fortunes that way. And also a lot of people, were communists and socialists as they are today and blamed the imperial system and said capitalism and so-called free systems are inherently aggressive. And it was really Britain and France trying to defend their imperial empire. And it was so unfair to Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what happened. And then we had this unjust treaty, the Versailles Treaty, and it was really, our mistake in disarming and disrespecting German nationalism that's provoking the Nazis and the rise of the fascist powers. And you know what? The Nazis and the fascists in Italy and the Imperial Japanese make the trains run on time. And their economies look like they're doing pretty good. This free enterprise stuff and free political system stuff just doesn't seem to work. Look at this Great Depression that we're in. How come we can't be like them? And, not only that, but their people are very enthusiastic about the societies that they live in and support their political leaders. Not these losers that we have in our system. And not only is the nation state system based on Western democracies corrupt and not worth supporting, but we really need to transition away from the idea of the nation state and, have the League of Nations and, have a system of international law. They didn't call it arms control at the time, but the way to provide for our security is not by building up our military forces and have arms racing with Germany and Japan and fascist Italy, but by having international law so that everybody will obey the rules of the road. And we can even abolish law through war, through the international law, like by the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This rhetoric coming out of Hitler and Mussolini and from the militarist Japanese you know, you really have to take that with a grain of salt. You know, these people are, you know, are motivated, you know, by patriotism, and they're really speaking to their own internal audience. You know, we can deal with these guys. You know, they don't, everybody knows from the common experience of World War I that we can't have a World War II again, you know, so we can deal with Hitler, you know, and just take with a grain of salt, and all of the other fascist totalitarian powers, and come to an arrangement, with them so that we'll all live in peace together, you know, through the League of Nations and through international law. And if anybody has really got to exercise restraint, you know, it's us, because we're to blame, you know, for most of what's wrong with the world. You know, we're the dominant post-war power. We were before World War I as well. And again, it was our imperial and economic systems, you know, the imperialism, you know, that is largely responsible, and the greed that comes in our society, the bad values that our society has. And people really believe that to such a great extent that, you know, you had, for example, the Oxford Union Students Union signing petitions, promising that, you know, that they would never they would never volunteer or allow themselves to be drafted to fight in another war. And guys like Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Britain during this period, you know, basically ignored Churchill, ignored his warnings, and you know, and said, you know, there's not going to be another world war because the bombers will always get through. And they remembered the horrors of trench warfare, the machine gun, the weapons of mass destruction at the time, chemical weapons, machine guns, and now this new technology called the bomber and fighter aircraft. That was a whole new dimension to warfare. And the technology was becoming increasingly powerful. And there were whole new military doctrines out there based on the concept of air power, you know, that said, you know, future wars are going to be won by air power, by bombing population centers. So it was perceived a lot like the way nuclear weapons are perceived today. And they were so convinced that these horrific new technologies and all the rest would guarantee the peace that they neglected their defenses and, you know, did not build up military strength. In fact, they built it down during the London and Washington naval conferences with Japan and Nazi Germany. You know, they had a formula where we were supposed to lock in our naval superiority, the British and the Americans, vis-a-vis the Germans and the Japanese. But the Germans and Japanese cheated on those treaties, and they cheated on all the treaties.
It sounds like China today. You know, they'll push international law as long as it serves their purpose. But look how they have obeyed the law of the sea treaty in the South China Sea, and especially when the court in The Hague ruled against them, and they said, you know, they just go about doing whatever they want to do. Look how they fish illegally all over the world. Look at you know, how well they honored the treaty over Hong Kong. Whatever suits their purposes, they do it. They do it immediately. And if you dare question them, they attack you. Like, how dare you? And because they know that we're in that same position you're talking about today that we were in the 30s, with all this self-loathing that we're all consumed with today. So yeah, this sounds so much like the 1930s in so many ways. That's what really worries me, Peter. I see the drums of war in so many ways. I do hope we can avoid it, but we can only avoid it through strength. You know, we can't just bend down and let them run over us. And some people think, well, that would be good. That, you know, it's China's turn. I've had several people tell me that it's China's turn. We've messed it up so bad that we need to step back and let them have their turn. But they don't really realize what that means in terms of, look how they treat their very own people. They're horrible. They commit genocide in their own country. And they try to justify that on some of our past, which we've gone beyond. And, you know, but they're there now, and they don't care. They flaunt it in our face. And it's really frightening when you think about the kind of culture they have, the culture of monitoring everyone to the nth degree, which is going to get worse in time. And we're trying to emulate that here now. I'm here to talk of a social credit system here in the United States. So, and that would be a topic of a future video I'll do. But Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go all into this here in a minute. We're going to talk about a threat that Dr. Pry sees in that EMP attack from China is really probable by year 2032. A lot of these military tensions. If you're not subscribed to my channel, please subscribe and bang the update notification bell and click all so you can get these great videos. Who else brings you gentlemen such as Dr. Peter Vincent Pry here and many of the other guests I brought on here on this channel, like Ambassador Hank Cooper, General Ken Chrosniak. We just talked with John Hollerman yesterday. You've had, I brought on Command Sergeant Major Mike Mabee twice on this channel, and quite a few others who are experts in these areas. So we have a lot of good conversations here. Now, this conversation will go in great depth and cover a lot of ground. So just, I think this will be a good lesson for all our viewers in history and where we're at today. Also, not only do I do videos on, things like this, I also cover the prepping aspects of it, getting ready, including gardening, which I think is very important for the future, for your future. If the grid goes down, you better know how to grow your own food. I cover things like how to eat from the weeds and the trees, which is free. But also, you really need to stock up because you don't realize how tough these grid down times are going to be. So I do have a special I have right now. If you go to prepwithgreg.com, $300 off long-term food storage that lasts 25 years. It's lightweight because it is freeze dried. And this is real food. It's not mush like dehydrated stuff. This is real stuff. And it comes back looking like regular food, tastes like regular food, because that's what it is. And you get 2,000 calories a day. A lot of these people that talk about long-term food storage until you've got so many years worth of food, they don't put enough caloric intake in it. Some of them like 800 calories a day. You can't survive on that, my friends. You get 2,000 calories a day here, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Combination to make you a winner. $300 off the 3-month supply is great. It's like $2 and some change per, 60 some odd cents per meal. Now, if you get 6 of those buckets, if you get 1 month supply, you get 25% off. So you save $74. Great deal. Consider it. Go with prepgreg.com. So we'll come back with Dr. Pry here. You wrote a little article recently about the prospects that, because we had put out there this so-called notion that we're hardening our grid by 2032, which you and I both know is not actually happening, but it might induce China to try to attack us. In fact, China has actually alluded to this, that they might try to attack us before that point because they may think that, that we would have some edge on them they would not want us to have. So, Dr. Pry, tell us about that.
Well, maybe we could go back to that later.
Okay.
Because I just gave this long-winded description of the gathering storm and where we are relative to the 1930s.
Okay. Let's build from there then. Let's take it forward. Sorry, my bad. Let's go forward.
Another topic I wanted to talk about, which is I think a better analogy for this extended metaphor that I want to have throughout this interview, and that is the we have just discovered that China has built, initially we found that they had built 150 new ICBM silos, and now additional research has discovered an additional 100 silos. So the estimate is now that they've got 250 new ICBM silos building, probably for the DF-41 ICBM. And this is just enormously significant and enormously consequential. And I think it should calls into question, raise questions about enormous numbers of things. First of all, just in January, the Department of Defense gave the lowest estimate forever for the number of nuclear weapons that China has. The Department of Defense estimated that China has 200 nuclear weapons. And they were criticized by all people by Hans Christensen of the Union of Concerned Scientists, who is a far-left anti-nuclear activist, whose UCS has put out an estimate that China has 350 nuclear weapons, okay? And I and many of my colleagues have criticized Christensen and the UCS for grossly underestimating the likely number of nuclear weapons that China has, because we know that China has the capability, in terms of its ability to produce fissionable materials and the like, the rest, to build thousands of nuclear weapons. And they would have a strategic interest in doing it so. And they don't, like the United States, do anything openly. They have compelling reasons to keep it secret. More than a decade ago, a former DOD analyst, Phil Carver, discovered that China has this underground Great Wall, for example, a system of tunnels that's 5,000 kilometers long that belongs to China's strategic rocket forces. Now, what is the strategic rocket forces doing with underground tunnels of that extent? You know, Carver calculated they could hide enough mobile missiles in there for 3,000 warheads for their arsenal. And there, a Russian general, Viktor Yasin, independently estimated that China had up to 1,800 nuclear weapons. That was like 10 years ago. So you have these dissident analysts, you know, like in Russia, that Phil Carver, guys like Mark Schneider and myself have said, you know, DOD, you're all wrong. You know, China probably has thousands of nuclear weapons. They may have more nuclear weapons than the United States, you know, because we have no way of independently verifying how many weapons they have. You know, but we know what their manufacturing capabilities are. And we know that they conceal stuff from us and hide stuff from us. And we know they're close allies with the Russians, who have learned tremendous lessons about cheating on us and hiding stuff from us, and have gotten away with cheating on virtually every arms control agreement they've ever signed. And so the United States never does anything about that. And so China has learned very valuable lessons from its friends in Russia. So now we find 250 new ICBM silos being built in the desert for the DF-41, which is it's the equivalent of a mobile peacekeeper ICBM. Carries 10 warheads, selectable yield of I think it's 90, 125 kilotons, 250 and 350 kilotons. And it's got a very good accuracy of 100-meter CEP, which makes it a first strike weapon. It can destroy hardened Minuteman silos with just one weapon. Has over a 90% single shot kill probability against the Minuteman silo. And 250 silos represents 2,500 weapons that could be deployed in a few years on the DF-41 ICBM in these silos. And Rick Fisher, one of the best China analysts, he's an independent, another one of these dissident analysts like us, who's been saying the DOD has been underestimating China's nuclear arsenal for years, says, you know, also makes that prediction that they could have over 3,000 nuclear weapons, you know, when they deploy the DF-41 in these silos. And one of the things that's interesting and such a parallel with the 1930s is that it's almost amusing, if it weren't so scary and tragic, to see academics, DOD people, the Washington establishment bending over backwards now to try to reconcile these silos with the estimate that China has got only 200 nuclear weapons today, or maybe 350 nuclear weapons if you want to go with the left UCS estimate. One of the because that's what they used to did in the 30s, by the way, when they found that Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany were Germany wasn't supposed to have an air force at all, okay, but Churchill, you know, had access to intelligence, you know, that the British were aware of, that Germany was building an air force, and in fact, their air force became so powerful that it vastly eclipsed the combined British and French air forces. And likewise, Germans built submarines. They weren't supposed to be doing that. They were building pocket battleships. Japan was cheating on the naval agreement. And the reaction of the Western political military elites wasn't Churchill's common sense reaction was, these guys are getting ready for World War II. Their reaction was to come up with all kinds of complex rationalizations to explain away what was happening, why it wasn't happening, or if they conceded it was happening, saying, well, this is just an expression of their nationalism. It's normal for a great power to want to build up militarily strong, and we shouldn't have tried to impose these limits on them in the first place, because that's a provocative thing and we don't have the right to do it. Who are we to insist upon that? You know, and that the policy of appeasement is a dirty word today, the policy of appeasement, but it actually was the word they used to describe their policy. They were going to follow a policy of appeasement because that was the best way of avoiding World War II. And in effect, that's what we're doing right now, or at least our Washington political military elites trying to square the circle about, well, they're deploying all these silos, and that could be, thousands of weapons. And instead of admitting and going back and saying, this estimate has been wrong, that they only have a few hundred nuclear weapons, maybe 200 nuclear weapons. We've been wrong about that all along. They've hidden this from us, because they're not going to be manufacturing 3,000 nuclear weapons in a couple of years. They probably have stockpiled this and are ready like a coiled spring to deploy these DF-41s in a few years. But here's some of the rationalizations that are out there. One of the most interesting is frustrating is by a guy named Jeffrey Lewis, who is a big arms controller. He's one of the left-wing newspapers, the liberal mainstream newspapers' favorite nuclear expert. Even this guy, he's a political scientist. He's not a real scientist. He has no expertise on nuclear weapons, but he's the director of nuclear nonproliferation for East Asia for the Middlebury Institute, which is some Ivy League college. He briefly served as an intern in the Pentagon, and that's his in one of these positions where they'll bring in an academic to be in the Pentagon to fetch coffee for the people who do the and that's his only claim to having any kind of expertise. He really has no expertise on this. But Jeffrey Lewis's theory is that they're not going to put missiles in the silos, except for maybe 12 of the silos will have missiles in them. And what they're doing is called a shell game. So most of the silos are going to remain empty, and they'll probably only put 12 silos. And in this way, Jeffrey Lewis and the left and the Department of Defense can still be right that China only has 200 warheads, and they're not going to get more warheads. It's going to stay around that low level because the silos are really for a shell game. And the United States envisioned something like a shell game for the Peacekeeper ICBM, but it was too expensive because it costs a lot of money to build a hardened ICBM silo. And also the idea was the Peacekeeper was supposed to be mobile, and it would race around between the shelters. A silo, in order to move the ICBM, that's a complicated process. It can't be done easily. And the adversary is going to see when you take a missile out of the silo and put it into another silo. They're going to know exactly where it is. It can take more than a week to move an ICBM, and it's a big, visible kind of a process. So that argument makes no sense at all. There's no evidence from the Chinese side that they're planning a shell game with these missile silos. On the contrary, there was a report from the Global Times, I think it was earlier this year or late last year, that said, China, because the international situation has changed and America is becoming such a threat and getting so pushy, that we need to deploy 1,000 DF-41 ICBMs, okay? Or have, so they're talking about large numbers of DF-41s to be deployed. And this looks like it, that this is what they're doing. The DF-41 does, by the way, exist in a mobile mode. And if they were concerned about survivability, they could just make more mobile DF-41s. When you put an ICBM in a silo, even under arms control theory, which is what Jeffrey Lewis is supposed to be an expert in, that makes it a first strike weapon, because the silo is more vulnerable than a mobile system. The reward to an attacker, if you pull off a successful first strike, which you can do, is for every weapon you expend, you can destroy 10 of the other guy's warheads, because the DF-41 has got 10 warheads. It's a MIRV 10 warhead ICBM. So the exchange ratio is highly favorable if you're putting those things in silos and expecting them to survive a first strike. we have very accurate cruise missiles and missiles too that can destroy those missiles in silos. Putting them in silos only makes sense if you plan to use them before the enemy strikes your silo. So that's a clear indicator of a first strike weapon. The other thing about silos that's great from a first strike point of view is one of the things you're most worried about is that is achieving surprise, so that the adversary will not know when you're going to make that first strike. And because the silo-based ICBMs have underground cable systems, there's no radio leakage from them. So they can operate basically silently all the time. So we can't know what their status is. They can do all their communications over those underground cables. Whereas the mobile ICBMs, they rely on radio communications, and it's easier to intercept those radio communications. And so there's a greater possibility, if you're planning a surprise attack, of leakage, so that would say, hey, wait a minute, the radio traffic going on with these mobile ICBMs is spiking. What's going on over there? We've got to be worried about that. But you can't tell what's happening with these MIRV ICBMs. And the other thing, of course, that makes them a first strike weapon is that the F-41 has got these 10 accurate warheads. So every one of those missiles can destroy 10 of our targets. And they only need, by the way, 50 DF-41 ICBMs to do a first strike against all the targets, all the counterforce targets in the United States, because we've only got 400 ICBM silos. Then we've got a handful of command and control nodes. We've got 3 bomber bases and 2 ballistic missile submarine bases. So, 50 DF-41 ICBMs would be more than enough to cover the counterforce targets. But they're going to deploy, if every one of these silos gets a DF-41, that's 2,500 warheads just on the DF-41. And just that deployment alone gives them a huge advantage in warheads over the current triad, our nuclear triad. We only have 1,400 warheads on all of our missiles and all of our bombers, including the ballistic missile submarines. So that signifies not just a war-winning capability, but a nuclear blackmail capability, so that we'll know that they dominate the strategic balance. Now, so that's, they're bending over backwards. The other rationalization that is actually being used is the same one that was used in the 1930s. Other people, other academics and policymakers and the many panda huggers that exist within the Department of State, the Department of Defense say, well, we shouldn't get too alarmed just because China is building all these missile silos. After all, they are a great power, and they've been tolerant for so long, having only a small number of warheads relative to us. It's only natural that they're going to now want to be competitive with us and achieve at least parity, if not even have more nuclear weapons than we do. But that isn't that worrisome. That's just what great powers do. They want to be, the top dog, and it does not signify that they plan to use those weapons. And so there's nothing to worry about there. And that's exactly the same rationalization. You go back and you read The Gathering Storm, all right? It was being used in the 1930s by saying, well, Herr Hitler and the Japanese and the Italians, building up their military forces to such a great extent, they've been humiliated by us for a long time. This is really for their domestic political purposes, and also to assert their equality with us as a superpower on the world stage. And so, let's just appease them, go along and get along with them, but don't worry about it, because everybody knows that you can't win World War II. World War II is going to be the end of the world. Look what happened during World War I. And we're saying exactly the same thing today. Oh, nuclear war is unthinkable. World War III will be unthinkable. Everybody knows the power of these weapons of mass destruction and that they're not usable weapons. That's why Biden, this is classic 1930s stuff. In his summit with Putin in Geneva, I almost laughed. They made such a big deal about the joint statement that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Okay. Biden came back with that as proud of it as Neville Chamberlain was with his Peace for Our Time letter that he got from Adolf Hitler in 1938, in Czechoslovakia, and then in the next year, World War II started. This idea, and this is our heads buried in the sand. We are so much like the Western political and military elites from the 1930s in The Gathering Storm, except we have no Winston Churchill, unfortunately. This belief that they'll take a statement like that, and that was manna from heaven for all the anti-nuclear activists. Because they've gotten a lot of good mileage out of that from the Democrat left and the anti-nuclear left, saying, you see, the Russians agree with us that that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. They agree with us. Look at that statement they made in Geneva. But of course, just like in the 1930s, belying that statement is, if they really believe that, how come they're engaged, Russia and China both, in this unprecedented, massive buildup of nuclear weapons? How come they have these nuclear military exercises and their military doctrine says you can win a nuclear war, and they actually practice how to do it?
Well, they haven't listened to Putin say that he could win one. Putin's actually said it, and he said it recently. And they're building their hypersonic missiles and our hypersonics are failing left and right, and they have bunkers that can accommodate 40 million people in Moscow alone. I've been in those subway stations in Moscow. They are impressive, the part that we get to see, but they are extremely deep underground. They have a great bunker system there in Moscow.
That's another point that is also one of the bend over backwards, head in the sand rationalizations, okay? Another argument that is used to try to explain away the growing nuclear threat from both Russia and China, is our strategic missile defense system, okay? The argument from the left is that they're concerned that they won't have a second strike retaliatory capability because of our strategic missile defense system. And therefore, that's why they need to build up all these missiles. The reality, of course, is the United States has only got 44 national missile defense interceptors that were deliberately designed. They were designed during the Clinton administration deliberately to not be technologically capable of intercepting sophisticated missiles such as Russia or China might deploy. The truth is, they're not even good enough. They give us even the North Korean missiles give us a problem because they're based on Russian and Chinese technology. And we have no passive defenses, strategic, deep underground shelters for our military political elites, or massive civil defense shelters the way the Russians do. And the Russians have thousands of anti-missile systems. They have that do pose a significant threat. All of this together poses a significant threat to the credibility of our retaliatory second strike capability. But you never hear our people thinking about that contradiction. And the Russians and Chinese are clever enough that they actually do use as an excuse. They'll put it out there that the reason they're engaged in this massive buildup is they're concerned about the United States at some point in the future, deploying large-scale, massive anti-missile defenses, even though they have done it, even though Russia has done it, and China is in the process of doing it. And so again, we've got our head in the sand, looking for excuses for them, so that we don't have to worry about their massive buildup. The other irony about this too is how short our memories are. Biden comes home in triumph with his Peace for Our Time agreement with Putin. And just a few months ago, back in March and April, we were terrified, and our NATO allies were terrified that a big so-called military exercise being put on by Russia was really going to be mobilizing their forces for an attack on Ukraine that might even also become an attack on the frontline NATO member states. We were really worried about that. And it actually caused a severe international crisis. In the aftermath of that, they stood down the troops, you know, and there were threats that came out. I can't remember if we talked about it on this, but by a Russian spokesman saying that, you know, they wouldn't have to actually fight a nuclear war or a conventional war against us. They could defeat us in a cyber war. And the next war will be a cyber war. In their definition, by the way, a cyber war includes EMP, nuclear EMP attacks. And lo and behold, what has happened to the United States, you know, in the aftermath of that crisis? Well, we had the Russians hack the Colonial Pipeline. You know, that was the first, and a series of others, but the first one was the Colonial Pipeline that provides half the petroleum, not only for civilian consumption, but also for our East Coast military bases. You know, we can't operate, our military can't operate. You know, if the Colonial Pipeline gets shut down, we wouldn't be able to project forces to defend who? To defend Ukraine if we wanted to, and to defend our NATO member states. So, and there have been a series of, the other thing that Biden supposedly came up back with, in addition to his peace for our time, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought letter, was he supposedly got assurances from Putin that they weren't going to do any more cyber attacks on us. And that promise is immediately broken. You know, the cyber attacks have continued and they've gotten more and more aggressive, which is another sign of hostile intent, you know, because all of this is connected with pushing at us to see what are our limits. How far can they push us? You know, that's what Germany and Japan and fascist Italy did too. Hitler marching into the Rhineland, you know, taking taking over Austria, taking over Czechoslovakia, you know, and he became convinced that he could actually finally go into Poland and that they wouldn't do anything either. And it started World War II. And he did not mind that it started World War II because he thought the West would be a pushover, and he was almost right. You know, we almost, in fact, most people don't understand that. And here's where, you know, the historian comes out, because in part of our culture, you know, we have gotten so used to thinking that we won World War II, okay? And we ended up winning it so decisively from so many of our movies and our books and the like, that we won World War II. And Germany didn't have a chance. They never would have been able to prevail in World War II. And that's one of the other things that I think has contributed. It's a way that we have become like the 1930s, where people sort of forgot the enormous sacrifices that had to be made to win World War I in the 1930s. And that Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were not pushovers in World War I, right? And Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan and Italy were not pushovers either. The truth is, we actually didn't win World War II, okay? We didn't win World War II. Germany lost World War II, and the Imperial Japan lost World War II. They had won World War II in 1940, 1941. And they only lost World War II because they made some strategic miscalculations. You know, Germany in 1940 had conquered all of Western Europe, or had within his sphere of influence all of Western Europe, except Britain. Okay, so he'd accomplished his objectives, but then he made an enormous strategic miscalculation and decided to attack his ally, Russia, and invaded the Soviet Union. And he threw away his victory in World War II when he decided to do that. Just imagine if he had maintained the Hitler-Stalin pact and not invaded the Soviet Union, but instead decided, you know, we carved up the Baltic states and Poland together. Let's partner on carving up the Middle East. You know, I'll take over North Africa and you guys take over Iraq and Persia and India. You know, if they had done that, Hitler would have prevailed in World War II. The other big mistake was Japan, of course, attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. Had they not done that, that was a strategic miscalculation because it brought the United States into the war. Up until December 7th, 1941, in the attack on Pearl Harbor, American opinion was totally isolationist. 80–90% of the population did not want to get. They bought into this business of the merchants of death and the evils of imperialism and how we were foolish to have gotten involved in World War I. And they did not want to get involved in another European war. And Franklin Roosevelt was elected on the promise that he would not get us involved in another European war. It was only the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that turned that all around. If Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor, but did all the rest of its massive offensive that ended up capturing, basically the South Pacific areas, the United States probably politically wouldn't have come into the war. And Hitler made another strategic mistake because days after Pearl Harbor, he declared war on the United States. He shouldn't have done that, because Congress, even if they had gone to war against Japan, even after Pearl Harbor, Congress probably wouldn't have approved going to war against Nazi Germany too, if the Germans hadn't declared war on the United States. And that was the other key to losing, World War II. So,
Churchill made a big difference too. Had Churchill not taken the staunch stand he took, Great Britain could have fell. The United Kingdom could have fell to the Germans, just like everybody else over in Europe was falling. And if we hadn't had the beachhead, the United Kingdom, from which to stage our D-Day invasion and all the other air raids and things that we staged, we couldn't have went in and prevailed against Hitler like that. It would have been extremely difficult. And that was extremely difficult. But without that advantage, it would have been an order of magnitude worse should we have decided to have fought Hitler at some point later down the road.
Right. Nazi Germany, in a way, became a victim of its own success.
Bingo.
Because the invasion of France and the conquest of Western Europe was so spectacular, they didn't expect it to be that successful, and they weren't really prepared. Operation Sea Lion to invade Britain. What do we do after we conquer France? So Operation Sea Lion was sort of a makeshift thing they were starting to put together, and we were fortunate throughout the war that Hitler trusted Hermann Goering so much. I mean, Hermann Goering made so many bad mistakes for the Nazis militarily that one could almost believe that he was an agent working on our side. For example, the Dunkirk thing was only possible because of Hermann Goering, who promised Hitler that they didn't need to move the armor in, ground troops in, to finally destroy what was left of the British Army. He could do it all with air power. And that turned out not to be true, and it enabled the British Army to escape. But if the General Staff had had its way and did what it wanted to, there would have been no British Army left over. Practically there wasn't. They had left all their weapons and stuff on the shores of Dunkirk. And then Goering said, we don't really have to go forward with Operation Sea Lion to invade Britain. I can defeat them in the air. We'll do bombing campaigns against their aircraft in their cities, and I can bring them to their knees that way. The British were really afraid, because in the aftermath of Dunkirk, even after getting all those guys back, because there were no tanks, no artillery. I mean, there was no. They were basically unarmed. That the British did calculations that if the Germans used the large landing craft, speedboats, that could accommodate maybe 100 troops, each of them, that they could in one night, put the equivalent of division of a couple of divisions, infantry divisions, on various places of the English coast, and they wouldn't be able to stop that. And that would be enough of a bridgehead so that they could then move rapidly inward, use paratroopers to capture the airfields so that they wouldn't have air power control over the channel anymore. In other words, there was a very realistic options had the General Staff had a free hand and Hermann Goering hadn't been there to stop it, that they actually could have conquered and taken over Britain. But that's but to return to today, and the threat from China, what this signifies, in addition to this parallelism of denial behavior, psychological denial behavior that our political military elites are engaged in about the looming China threat, the grave question is raised in my mind about our political leadership, because these silos were not discovered, or at least they were not reported to us by the Department of Defense. The discoveries came from Jeffrey Lewis, of all people, who is now trying to explain them away. Okay, but Jeffrey Lewis, and there was another academic, I think it's the James Martin Center for International Security or something, but two independent academics hired undergraduate students to look through commercial satellite photography. And that's how the silos came into public light. And the Department of Defense admitted that last week. They basically confirmed, yeah, these are really ICBM silos. And it confirms what we've been saying, the Department of Defense says, about this massive buildup that China's engaged in. Now, the first part is true. Yeah, they're real ICBM silos. But the Department of Defense hasn't been going as far as these silos signify. They've been predicting that China might double its nuclear inventory in 10 years, which means 400 warheads, right? Not thousands of warheads. So part of the other question we have to ask as a constitutional republic, or what we're supposed to be a constitutional republic, what a question I wish Congress would ask, was why did the Department of Defense in effect lie to Congress, lie to the American people in their open, every January and February, the Director of National Intelligence, gives a worldwide threat briefing. And they didn't say anything about these ICBM silos. Now, it's being reported in the press. I don't know whether to believe it, that it's probably true, that the Pentagon knew about the ICBM silo fields. And that's why they were sounding the alarm about a growing nuclear threat from China. But the growing nuclear threat from China that they described was not consistent with the actual nuclear threat that we see in front of our eyes now from the satellite imagery. So how come they didn't talk about the full nuclear threat and talk about the ICBM silo fields? Why did they cover that up? Or are they so incompetent that they didn't know about it? I think they had to know about it, because these fields cover, hundreds of square kilometers. And so it's hard to believe that they're so incompetent they didn't see them. And that Jeffrey Lewis could find them from commercial photography, but that they couldn't find them. But why not come out? This is an enormous development, and represents a sea change in not just the numbers of weapons and all the rest, but what China's intentions are, and what kind of a threat they are. And the Department of Defense sat on that and didn't tell us. So those are some of the concerns, and that's why that's such an enormously consequential development. And yet our reaction to it is more alarming to me than the actual growing nuclear threat from China. Our head in the sand posture, our making up excuses, our failure to see the implications of these facts that we can actually see through our satellite photography, that this is a nuclear gun pointed at our heads, from China. And we want to believe that it's just business as usual, really, and there's nothing to worry about. The other part of the reaction is, even in the aftermath, okay, we found out about this enormous nuclear threat from China. We also know about the nuclear and cyber threats from Russia. And what is the Democrat Party that is basically in control, pretty much dominates Congress and is in control of the White House. what they wanted, the Biden administration's reaction to this, is well, let's go negotiate an extension of the New START treaty with Russia, even though they violated all the other treaties. They violated the Presidential Nuclear Initiative on Tactical Nuclear Weapons. They violated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. They violated the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. They're probably violating the New START treaty. It's the only treaty left that the State Department claims they're still in compliance with it. But that's just because they haven't been forced to admit that Russia's violating it yet. They basically had to be forced to admit that they were violating all those other treaties. The State Department is always the last one to end up admitting to these violations. And unfortunately, it's up to them to decide when violations happen. And they have a vested interest as a bureaucracy to never report these violations and to explain them away because they negotiated these treaties. Their bread and butter is these treaties. Their claim to fame in the history books is that these treaties are successful later. So the State Department is always the last one that wants to admit these treaties are violated. But Biden has sent us, we're going to try to save the New START treaty by negotiating. And Putin has agreed to that. He's agreed to that. But why? Because Putin wants everything on the table. Putin wants our strategic defenses on the table. He basically wants to use the negotiations to lock us into a position of permanent inferiority. And what I think they're most afraid of, what they've always been afraid of, there is a little truth in their utterance about their concern about future U.S. strategic anti-missile defenses, because they've never forgotten Ronald Reagan and the Strategic Defense Initiative. That's the one thing that could checkmate their offensive nuclear capabilities and change the strategic environment from one that favors striking first and aggression to favor the defender. And it would represent a change from mutual assured destruction that was never mutual for them to a situation that I have described as strategic assured national existence, sane, where our defensive principle is based not on holding hostage the populations and military forces of the other side, but on protecting our people from weapons of mass destruction by shooting them down. And, we can still do that, with a system like Brilliant Pebbles that Ambassador Cooper estimates could be deployed in 5 years for $20 billion, which is chicken feed compared to what we're spending on a modernizing, so-called modernizing, really recycling our nuclear deterrent. And even when we're done with it, if we get everything we want for our nuclear deterrent, it's going to be inferior to what Russia and China have, if only because the weapons on are antiques. They're not new weapons. We're planning to build new, more modern delivery systems in 10 years. It's going to take 10 years to get them. Russia has already, and China have already got new modern delivery systems and new warheads that are based on new advanced technologies because they've been cheating on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty for 30 years. The State Department finally admitted that last year after 30 years of cheating. So they've got 10 decades of a technological march on us when it comes to advanced nuclear weapons, super EMP weapons, X-ray weapons, ultra low yield, dial yield, all the stuff they've got that we don't have, okay? And we're planning, to the Hawks in the Pentagon, the DREAM program that they inherited from President Trump. It was really Obama's idea of a modernization program, is to have in 10 years, we'll have new delivery systems, new submarines, new ICBMs. We have to have, because all the other stuff that we've got now will be at the end of their useful service life, but they're still going to be delivering antique warheads that were designed during the Reagan administration or before and untested. So we don't even know if they'll work. That's not a bargain. And that's the other thing. I was just working on an article now, and I'm going to go back to working on it after this interview. But it just strikes me. We're in so much trouble as a civilization because we have even the best people who are in power currently in the Department of Defense, who are concerned about the nuclear threat. Their answer to that is our current modernization program. Now, before I want to contrast that though, all of this, what the Democrats really want to do is dismantle our triad. Powerful forces like Adam Smith, who's the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. After President Biden, he's one of the most important people in the U.S. government under defense policy because he writes the defense budget. And Adam Smith, wants to get rid of all of our ICBMs. He doesn't even want us to have the 400 obsolete ICBMs that we've got now. He also wants to eliminate the nuclear weapons on the strategic bomber force and cut our ballistic missile submarine force in half, so that we'll have only 6 submarines, okay, and go down to a minimum deterrent level. And some Democrats want to do more than that. The Arms Control Association and a bunch of Democrats, including Elizabeth Warren, sent an article, a letter to Biden within the past couple of weeks, saying, we should go to a minimum deterrent posture of a few hundred weapons. We shouldn't have more than a few hundred weapons. Put them on ballistic missile submarines, because everyone knows you can't win a nuclear war, right? Putin admitted it in Geneva. You can't, and a nuclear war should never be fought. So all we need is this token symbolic minimum deterrence force. And fortunately, the responsible people in Washington, the more responsible people in Washington, the nuclear hawks, so-called hawks, what passes for nuclear hawk these days in the Pentagon and elsewhere, have criticized the letter and said, no, we've got to go forward with our current modernization program. But to be honest with you, and I support our modernization program too. I think we've got to go forward and do it, but it's not adequate. What we're doing is not adequate. The truth is, if we do everything that we're planning to do in the modernization program, it's going to really be, by Cold War standards, a minimum deterrent. So you've got 400 new ICBMs, each one with a single warhead. You'll have a handful of bombers. B-50. We'll still have B-52s, but we've got a new delivery, a new bomber. With some cruise missiles, and we'll have new submarines to carry the sub-launched ballistic missiles, and we'll have the total number of weapons will be in compliance with the New START Treaty. We don't even build up to the New START Treaty levels. The New START Treaty allows us 1,550 weapons, but we only build up to 1,400. In fact, a little fewer than 1,400. We've got something in the range of 1,300 weapons. And we have almost no tactical nuclear weapons anymore. We used to have 15,000 tactical nuclear weapons. Now we've got 200 obsolete gravity bombs stored in bunkers, the locations of which are all known to the Russians, okay, in various NATO member states. Russia has, this is not, parity. This is not, deterrence maximalism by any stretch of the imagination. This is minimum deterrence. It's minimum deterrence when you let your adversary, have a 10-fold advantage in numbers of nuclear weapons. It is minimum deterrence when you let your adversary have an enormous advantage, a 30-year advantage in technological sophistication of nuclear weapons. And it's minimum deterrence when you turn a blind eye to adversary cheating, on all these arms control agreements. So they have categories of nuclear weapons and delivery systems that we don't even have in our inventory. And they're probably cheating on the START II treaty to boot. Mark Schneider, one of the analysts I respect most, has calculated that they probably have a 2-to-1 advantage in strategic nuclear weapons over us. That's not deterrence maximalism. That's a minimum deterrent. So while I agree with all the critics and the so-called Pentagon hawks that the idea of going down to 300 warheads is irresponsible, and that's deterrence minimalism, what we're planning to do isn't much better. It's also deterrence minimalism. we have forgotten the lessons of the Cold War. We have forgotten the lessons of the Cold War. The political.
If we have to face both China and Russia simultaneously,
Oh,
especially with what China's building up, we're nowhere. We have nothing. If you look at and all of our treaties in the past have been, just with the idea that China's not a player, it's just us and Russia, and China has really been sneaking up on us. This number of warheads, which you've been talking about, the 200 to 350, is a number that China's claimed for decades. It's like they built up a manufacturing capacity and suddenly stopped decades ago, and they're not making anything. And we know that the manufacturing capacity is increasing, and they're developing a new nuclear power plant right now, breeder reactor, which appears to be set up entirely to accelerate it even further. So literally they could have thousands of warheads sitting on hand right now, ready to put in those silos, and with more coming. So what in the world is that all about? That's crazy. Yeah, it's a first strike capable. And one other thing I'd like to add before I turn it back to you, Peter, is that China had pledged some time back that they would never, ever even threaten a non-nuclear nation. In addition, that they would never have a first strike. But they've already violated that. They've already just threatened Japan.
Anybody with common sense, but our so many, at least half of our political military elites and most of our China experts in the intelligence community believe that no first use pledge. In fact, the anti-nuclear crowd uses China against us nuclear hawks, so-called nuclear hawks. They use China against us. Part of the reason for the wrong estimates on China's nuclear strength and on China's doctrine, like the no first use pledge, part of the reason that it's so difficult to get people to see the truth and to overcome those things is that has been a very useful propaganda tool for not just China, but for Democrats and the anti-nuclear movement to beat up on the United States. Because they'll say things like, why do we need so many nuclear weapons? Look at China. It's only got 300 nuclear weapons. Now the Pentagon says 200. Why can't we be like China and build down these expensive, dangerous nuclear weapons to the low levels that China has? Why can't we be like China and be more responsible and have a no first use pledge, so that because that way it makes nuclear war unlikely, less likely, because that way they'll know that we're promising that we won't be the first ones to use nuclear weapons, so they don't have to worry about a first strike from the United States. And that letter that went from the Democrats to Biden, within the past week or two, also includes that, by the way. They're calling for a no first use pledge, for the United States to embrace a no first use pledge. And which, by the way, actually makes nuclear war and nuclear proliferation more likely, because the reason the United States doesn't invoke a no first use pledge, first, it wouldn't be believed. Anybody who has any general or political leader worth his salt shouldn't base his national security on the idea that the other side is promising not to do something, but our allies, Japan, all over the world, rely on our nuclear umbrella for their security. It's called extended deterrence. And if you give a no first use pledge, that means we're basically saying to our allies, you can go to hell. We're not going to protect you anymore with our nuclear deterrent. And that means they're going to say, well, maybe we need to build our own nuclear deterrent. And so the whole point of not having the no first use pledge was actually an anti-nuclear, our refusal to be irresponsible and give a no first use pledge has contributed more to non-proliferation than almost anything else we've ever done, because it means that France and China don't have to build up huge arsenals. They've got the United States at their back. And it has prevented countries like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and other of our allies from going nuclear, because they're not on their own. They know they're supposed to be able to rely on the United States. And it's crucial to keep that pledge credible, by maintaining true strategic parity, with our adversaries. And we haven't done that, as I mentioned, even when we're done modernizing the triad under the current plan, we're going to be inferior to China. We're going to be inferior to Russia. And frankly, we might even be inferior to North Korea, not in terms of numbers of weapons, but here's where we can get into the EMP discussion, because one of the great misconceptions, is the simplistic idea that comes to us from arms control, by the way. We're the only ones that subscribe to arms control theory. This is an artifact of our own civilization, this belief that you can negotiate with the other side and sign pieces of paper with the other side, just like it's some kind of a domestic contractual business affair in terms of our internal. That's how our society works inside. People obey the law, people respect contracts. So you can have win-win outcomes. All of that is basically the core belief systems of arms control, which Russia and China and North Korea and Iran reject. They don't believe any of that stuff. They don't believe in coexistence. They don't believe in the value of contracts or international law. They believe in the living and the dead. They believe in zero-sum games. And so they're not going to believe no first use pledges or any of that crap. But they know that we do, and so they use that against us. They know that we will obey the treaty. And so they get to cheat on the treaties. That's the only reason they signed the treaties with us.
Go ask the people in Hong Kong how well those treaties work for them.
Yeah, that's right. And as you were alluding to this, okay, take the no first use pledge. China has had this no first use pledge. Well, when Japan just recently came out, it was the deputy minister of Japan, did what a good ally is supposed to do. The topic was Taiwan, and America is going to defend Taiwan. We've got a commitment to defend Taiwan. And Japan did what we want Japan to do, what a good ally is supposed to do, and said, we assess that the independence of Taiwan is vital to our strategic interests, and we're also an ally of the United States. So if America commits itself to the defense of Taiwan and comes to Taiwan's defense, we're going to be there. We're going to help America defend Taiwan. And the reaction of China to that was this so-called unofficial website, but it's associated with the People's Liberation Army. All these unofficial websites are the voice of the Communist Party. I mean, that's coming right from there is no such thing as an independent website in China.
You can't issue that kind of stuff without approval.
Especially ones that are run by a general, okay, like this one is. And, so it's basically the voice of the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Communist Party. And they went ballistic. They basically said in reaction to that they're going to make an exception to their no first use pledge of Japan, okay? And if Japan puts one soldier or one plane or one aircraft to help the United States defend Taiwan, they will nuke Japan and nuke them continuously and annihilate Japan and force Japan to surrender like they did in World War II.
Now that says three things. Peter, because one, they violated their no first use. Two, they violated a principle they stated before that they said they would never threaten a non-nuclear nation. Okay, they just threatened a non-nuclear nation. And the ability to nuke continuously also suggests that they have more than 200 or 300 nukes. So we get three lessons out of that one threat.
Right. And this is also consistent with the thinking of their military, we know, because back in 2005, a Russian general threatened to nuke Los Angeles if we tried to defend Taiwan. So this idea of this no first use pledge, if you have half a brain, China's behavior and activities, but now it's just out there and so overt, must be making it very uncomfortable for the panda huggers and all the apologists in the West, when China does something like that. And that's one of the reasons why this thing that should have been, this statement, which should have been banner headline, should have been on the front page of the New York Times, and the whole statement should have been there, because there's more in the statement than the first strike threat against Japan. That's really highly significant. They go on to say they're not going to do it alone. That the missile strikes on Japan, they will be joined by Russia and North Korea. in making these nuclear missile strikes on Japan.
Oh.
And moreover, after they annihilated Japan and forced Japan into surrender, like in World War II, the Japan will be broken up. They won't be allowed to continue to exist as a nation. The 4 main islands of Japan will become independent nations with peace constitutions imposed on them by who? China and Russia.
Yeah.
And China and Russia will militarily occupy Japan with troops. That is really significant. And acknowledgement of what we're talking about in terms of this new bloc, okay, that China and Russia really are strategic partners, and so is North Korea. And another thing they said, it was sort of a general statement that that this is necessary. This new thinking in terms of their nuclear policy is necessary because times have changed, and we are now facing this grave international crisis because of the increasingly aggressive posture of the United States. I guarantee you that, just like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan going back to the 30s and 40s, had grand schemes. They had plans to divide the United States, down the Mississippi River, Nazi Germany to get the west half, Japan. I guarantee you that the Russians and the Chinese and probably the North Koreans and the Iranians have got similar scheme, when it comes to the whole world, and their potential enemies. That's what they would do to Japan. I'm sure they've got plans in terms of dividing up. South Korea will go back to North Korea. The whole globe is probably divided up among these guys, in their scheme of what the new global, the global world order, the new world order will look like, when they take over and when they dominate the situation. And the frightening thing is, it isn't just a fantasy. They could pull it off because of EMP and cyber warfare, in addition to the nuclear capabilities that they have. Because one of the things Americans don't get, we don't think about these things the way they do. We're not chess players, we're checkers players. And I hope you can still see me. I've got something came up on my screen that's blocking my view.
I can still see you, Peter. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Is that, as Sun Tzu said, the greatest victory is to win without war. And the nuclear threat enables you to do that you can achieve victories. Russia and China are achieving victories right now in the global balance of power without war because of the nuclear deterrent. We should have learned this lesson ourselves during the Cold War. We won the Cold War without it becoming a thermonuclear World War III because of our nuclear deterrent. Our nuclear deterrent prevented Russia from using its vast superiority in conventional forces from overrunning NATO Europe. And it forced them to compete with us. They built up, in their effort to arms race with us and beat us, it ended up crushing their economy and resulting in their peaceful loss of the Cold War.
And that was another reason for not having a no first use policy, was that they numerically in Europe were ahead of us. Had it not been for that policy, they could have comfortably overran Europe. And they already had street signs made up for all the streets throughout Europe. They were fully planning to take Europe. And it was not having a no first use policy that kept them from doing it, because they knew that they faced that kind of threat from us. And now, we're so flippantly ready to trade it away, which is nuts.
Right. Even North Korea, the EMP Commission assesses that they've got super EMP weapons. We have no equivalent to that. They've got 2 satellites that orbit over this country that might be armed with super EMP weapons to do a surprise EMP attack. That alone, if they did a super EMP attack, these super EMP weapons generate such high field strengths, 100,000 volts per meter or more, that not only would they paralyze our electric grids and other life-sustaining critical infrastructures, but it could knock out our hardened nuclear deterrent, including the command and control systems. And one of the things that's also going wrong, we still have no plans to harden against super EMP weapons. That's another thing that makes our modernizing plans a minimum deterrent. We should at least be hardening systems so that they'll survive super EMP attack. But no, as far as I know, they're still clinging to the 50,000 volts per meter as the military standard, and they're having a hard time meeting that military standard.
Yeah, and Dr. William Graham actually testified to Congress that according to Soviet generals, the number he got for their capability of those EMP super weapons was 200,000 volts per meter.
That's right.
So and that's in the congressional record.
Right. And that they could take out the ICBMs, that we never designed our strategic command and control. What about the ballistic missile submarines at sea? Well, they're helpless if they can't get emergency action messages. You need those to unlock the missiles and to launch the missiles. And they have to come back to port sometime, so that they can be easily destroyed. Either by hunter killer subs that are looking for them, or when they go back into port, they can only stay out there for 6 months. The crews will starve to death. You need to replace chemicals so that the oxygen can be provided, so these guys can breathe underwater. You can't stay there underwater forever. And so eventually, even the submarines would be not only rendered neutralized by EMP, but put in a position where they could be physically destroyed. And so even North Korea could do that and potentially win, a nuclear war with the United States, because you have to look at nuclear war fighting in a more sophisticated way, the way they do. It's called force-on-force exchange modeling. What can you actually do with the nuclear weapons that you have when you strike first against an adversary, okay? It's a lot easier to strike first, and you can accomplish a lot more when you're striking first than when you're trying to strike second, precisely because nuclear weapons are so powerful and destructive. Even one hit with a super EMP weapon could decide a war in favor of North Korea. And also think about what a president would do. Even if he could launch a nuclear retaliatory strike against North Korea, would he do that and risk another EMP attack in America that would put us even deeper in the dark? Or would a president be more likely to say, the electric grid and all the life-sustaining critical infrastructures are down. Millions of Americans are going to start dying because there's no water and the food is spoiling. My highest priority is to provide for the common defense of the American people. So I've got to mobilize all the remaining assets that still work, which is going to be the Department of Defense, to try to bring back the critical infrastructures. The hell with South Korea. North Korea can have South Korea. I've got to save 300 million American lives. That's a very plausible scenario. That's how North Korea and Russia and China think about these things. And they also think about these things this way, as a chess player. They know that we know, all right? And so they know that when they commit some act of aggression, and that's why they're constantly pushing the envelope to see how far they can get away with it, all right? That we will be deterred, that we will be deterred from getting involved in that nuclear World War III, because we know we're going to lose. So you don't ever actually have to use this vast, sophisticated stockpile of nuclear weapons, and maybe not even the EMP weapons, because it's enough that we know that they have the capability, and that capability translates into the power to win World War III without a nuclear war. The way we did in the Cold War. We won the Cold War without it having to become a nuclear war. And they learned the lesson of the last war, but we've forgotten that lesson. And you can just see that in terms of how even the nuclear hawks, and the crazy people, who unfortunately are very much in charge in the Biden administration. I'm very afraid that the Nuclear Posture Review in January 2022, that they're going to use that to actually go with the minimum deterrence thing that's being proposed by Ed Markey and Elizabeth Warren, and get rid of the triad and go down to 300 weapons. I think that's a real possibility that could happen in the Nuclear Posture Review. And it will provide the Biden administration with political cover and say, well, we were responsible. We did the nuclear posture review, and the people he's putting in, like Jill Ruby, okay, people who she's just left the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is an anti-nuclear group, and she's going to be one of the most important people. She's going to be the director of the administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration, one of the most important experts, okay? You know, people like that might well sign on, you know, to go into that minimum deterrence. But we're not out of the woods if that doesn't happen, and we're going to go forward with our current triad plans. You know, it's let me try to put this in common sense terms to explain it a little more. You know, the great generation that won the Cold War, and that many of them had living memories of World War II. So they knew and remembered the kind of stuff that happened in the 1930s, and were very suspicious of that and didn't want it to happen again. And you didn't, although you heard that kind of talk on the left where they were covering up and making excuses, most Democrats and most Republicans from that Cold War era were responsible and didn't make up excuses and didn't bury their heads in the sand. And they made whatever technological and financial investment was necessary to make sure that certain principles were observed in the maintenance of our nuclear deterrent. That it should be second to none was the first and most important principle, second to none. That meant that we should have at least as many nuclear weapons as our strongest possible adversary. That those nuclear weapons should be as technologically sophisticated as those that our adversary has, or more so. You know, that we should have extended deterrence. None of this no first use pledge stuff, you know, because our alliance system, that is a great part of our strength, depends upon extended nuclear deterrence. And all of that has been forgotten, it seems, including by the so-called nuclear hawks today, you know, who support the current program for modernizing the triad. Because the current plan, even if we get out of the woods with Joe Biden and we go forward with this current plan that President Trump was supporting, okay? And I'm not blaming President Trump for this bad program. President Trump got bad advice. He was criticized early in his administration when he got a briefing on the nuclear balance. There was a lot of press criticizing President Trump for getting upset that we had only parity with Russia under the New START treaty. President Trump wanted us to have superiority. You know, he said, how come we don't have 10,000 nuclear weapons? What happened to our 10,000 nuclear weapons, you know, that we used to have? What happened to our 15,000 tactical nuclear weapons? And he was right. You know, if we had done nothing, but just, even if they were old, at least we would have had vast numerical superiority. And we would have been better off today if we hadn't engaged in the New START treaty and the Presidential Nuclear Initiative and given all that away for nothing, okay? But we did. And so President Trump was shocked because it violates common sense that you're going to go from a position where you had unquestioned superiority, you know, or the potential to get that, where you allowed through the treaty process the other side to maintain parity with you, all right? And now they actually have superiority. President Trump was beaten up in the Washington Post and other newspapers for taking that position because he was obviously not sophisticated enough to understand arms control and the way to think about strategic matters. But he was right, and you know, and President Trump would have been supported by a lot of the real nuclear hawks, you know, during the Cold War. I think you know, to try to find a common sense metaphor or to explode another argument that is used by the left and the anti-nuclear crowd. You know, the people who are anti-nuclear, they like to pretend, and the way they represent themselves is they're the responsible ones from a scientific and moral and point of view because they know that nuclear weapons are so terrible, and that nuclear use would be so terrible and unacceptable for humanity, that we must have as few nuclear weapons as possible and engage in things like no first use pledges. And maybe our objective should be to eventually have agreements so that nuclear weapons are banned, so that they don't exist anymore, which is a pie in the sky dream, that because aspirations like that have never happened in human history. The only thing that ends up abolishing a weapon system in human history is when it becomes obsolete and it's surpassed by a new, better weapon system. All right. It's the only time it happens. Even the Pope couldn't ban the crossbow in the Middle Ages for use against Christians, which is what he tried to do. And he had a lot more power and say, because he was supposed to be God on earth, to the populations of the time. So I ask you, let's change it from nuclear weapons to another issue. Let's say, burglary. We're against burglary. And who's the more responsible person, and who takes the burglary threat more seriously? The person who wants to take a minimum deterrence position and say, well, I can deter burglars by putting a sign in my door that that I've got a burglar alarm system. But I'm not going to invest in the burglar alarm or anything else, but I'll put a sign on there so I've got a symbolic defense against burglary, which is basically what minimum deterrence is. It's not a war fighting capable, it's a symbolic defense against nuclear war. All right. Or is the person more responsible and really understands the danger of burglary and doing more to prevent burglary, the person who, in addition to having the sign in his door, has an actual burglar alarm system in his house, has guns and ammunition in his house to protect his family from burglars, and wants to spend money on a police force, so that he can have extended deterrence by having a well-armed, well-trained police force to arrest burglars. I submit to you that it's this person who has made the massive investments in anti-burglary systems of all kinds that is more serious and is morally superior, to the people who say they're against burglary, but all they want to do is put a sign in the window, that's a symbolic defense against burglary. And I think that this is perfectly analogous to the situation we have in terms of the anti-nuclear people versus the so-called nuclear hawks, that the moral high ground is really held by the nuclear hawks. And it used to be that the great generation, that's why the great generation that had experienced World War II and that lived through the Cold War and that had been sponsoring nuclear tests. We used to test nuclear weapons, which I think was valuable, not just from a technological point of view, so that the other side would not achieve technological superiority, but it was also was advantageous from a moral view. It was a constant reminder that these are not just symbols, but these are real weapons. They actually exist, and they can do terrible things. The seismic signals that you're picking up, equivalent to earthquakes, reminds you of the near and clear and present danger of nuclear weapons, and contributed to keeping elites and political and military leaders on their toes, so that they would faithfully adhere to those principles that enabled us to win the Cold War and prevail in the Cold War without it becoming a thermonuclear war, by maintaining at least parity with our adversaries in numbers, by having technological parity, with our adversaries, by actually taking it seriously enough so that we were locked and loaded and ready for a nuclear war should one happen, by having an extended deterrence to our allies, all of that is taking the nuclear weapon, having respect for that technology, having respect for the horrors of something like a Hiroshima and Nagasaki happening by the thousands. And you're doing everything you can. You have a moral obligation to do all these things to make sure that you don't have Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's by the thousands. That's how we used to think about it. But now even our best people, even our so-called nuclear hawks, are willing to go along and get along with this new triad that we've got that falls short on all those terms. You know, so we're in huge trouble. I mean, we're really back in the gathering storm, you know, era like the 1930s again. You know, where we have nobody in charge anymore. There are people like me. There are people who are retired, okay, you know, who came from that era, who think that way, but none of us have our hands on the levers of power anymore. So we write our articles, we write our books, we come on shows like this, and we do our thing. We do our Winston Churchill thing, but not nearly as eloquently or as intelligently as the real Churchill was able to do it. And we hope that somebody listens and that maybe it'll make a difference. But we're in huge trouble. You know, we don't have a Winston Churchill in our gathering storm of the year of our Lord 2021, the way we did in the 1930s. You know, I keep hoping and praying and looking for him, you know, there's somebody that can turn this around. But boy, we don't even have anything in the pipeline that resembles what the Cold War generation would have done to deter Russia and China and North Korea. I mean, you just take one example of the super EMP weapon. Doesn't it make sense that we should engage in nuclear testing if we have to, you know, to develop a super EMP weapon, if only to deter them from using their super EMP weapon, right? You know, if only to understand what it can do and in terms of its effects on our strategic systems and all the rest. You know, we can't even do that. And as a matter of fact, the last person, I had a good friend of mine, Lisa Gordon Haggerty. Oh, you know, she was Trump's administrator of the Nuclear Security Administration, the National Nuclear Security Administration. Okay, and she was a real hero. You know, she was just parachuted in, you know, made her the director of that administration, where she had to work with all these Obama holdovers and holdovers from the Clintonista era, you know, people who were basically anti-nuclear in their bones. They were go along and get along. They were perfectly happy with the fact that we had not engaged in nuclear testing for 30 years. You know, kind of people that think climate change is a bigger threat, existential threat than a nuclear holocaust. All right. And yet, before she got fired, you know, she was able to, she was the first person to you know, in the last year when she was there, for the first time, we were going to develop a nuclear weapon of new design. It wasn't a dramatic departure from past nuclear weapons, okay? You know, but at least it was of new design, using new technology. And that was so opposed, you know, within the bureaucracy, that the staff, the Obama holdover staff in the Department of Energy, managed to get Lisa fired. Okay, I was just so disappointed. Of course, it happened late in the Trump administration. President Trump was running for re-election. Even Senator Imhoff, you know, who was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, came out and said, Lisa Gordon Haggerty is right. She shouldn't be fired. You know, she should be given a medal, you know, for being able to do this. And when you think about it, it's a remarkable achievement. Imagine that you are at the head of a bureaucracy, but you're opposed by almost everybody, you know, 15,000 people in that bureaucracy working against you and trying to undermine you. And yet you managed to move that system forward and even managed to start getting out of that system a commitment to develop a nuclear weapon of new design. And then, but unfortunately, you know, she got canned because the left agitated against her. And they were very successful, as everybody who knows the story, in terms of getting real Trump type people fired. Sebastian Gorka, other people who were Trump loyalists, were anti-establishment type people, which is what we need now, to change course, but at least she fell on the battlefield, with honor. My mentor, the late great Dr. Bill Van Cleve, told me when I came to Washington that if you don't get fired at least once for doing the right thing, then you're not doing your job. So Lisa did her job, and but it's a shame because that happened. It's a shame President Trump didn't get reelected. It's a shame that he didn't stand by her. He should have stood by her. She still would have been. I think that these positions last across administrations, so she still would have been there. Instead, we're getting Jill Ruby to replace her from the Nuclear Threat Initiative, from these anti-nuclear people. So you can be sure that not only is that new warhead not going to ever be developed, but they also want to eliminate some of the other nuclear weapons that we're trying to recycle. They call it modernization. It's really not modernization. It's patching up and recycling antiques, to keep the nuclear deterrent going. But we're in big trouble, my friends. If you haven't read The Gathering Storm, really go read Winston Churchill's The Gathering Storm. And it is just so reminiscent of where we are today. And with no Winston Churchill at the end of the tunnel to save Western civilization from what's coming.
Wow. Hope we can find a Winston Churchill somewhere. We need one badly, but maybe somebody can step up to the plate. Maybe they're just hiding in the corners because of, our media beats everybody down so hard. Our social media, the main media, if you're trying to merge and you're a category like that, they're going to browbeat you into nothingness and probably pull your accounts and so forth. So when we look at the threat before us, right now we've got a lot of immediate attention with Iran. And I'm afraid that Iran may be used by China as cover. Maybe if we can get all tied up with Iran, China could create other military adventures, assume that we're all tied up over there, such as take Taiwan or something else.
Iran is one of the things that really worries me the most in terms of where could this all start,
Where and when.
Yeah.
When is very important too in our metrics of things.
Exactly. There's a statement by the Israeli defense minister this week that Israel now estimates that that Iran is 10 weeks away from the bomb. That technologically they're 10 weeks away from the bomb. And as you know, I've talked about this before. I and a lot of my colleagues, some of the people I have the most respect for in the intelligence community, including Jim Woolsey, former CIA director, and Fritz Marth, former chairman of the National Intelligence Council, Dr. Graham, who's President Reagan's science advisor, and others, Hank Cooper. All of us think that Iran already has the bomb.
Yeah,
and on nuclear missiles too. And they might even be on a technological par with North Korea. The difference between Iran and North Korea, in fact, you can almost see the totalitarian bloc deciding to do an experiment with North Korea and Iran. With North Korea, they made North Korea a nuclear weapon state overtly to see how much they could get away with and how far they could push it. But with Iran, they're doing it overtly or covertly to see how far they could get away with that and maybe what they could get away with there. And my concern here is that if the Israelis aren't listening to their analysts like me on the Israeli side, and I know there are a lot of them because I've been to Israel, and actually every intelligence officer, and including high-ranking officials I talked to over there, said they agreed with us that they think Iran actually already has the bomb. But they haven't been willing to say that in public because they're afraid that the U.S. intelligence community would then punish them, and that especially it was during the Obama administration, they were concerned that the United States would and the State Department would punish them, that would alienate us as partners if they came out and departed so radically with what the official Washington view is. Okay, so I don't know if the new defense minister's position is what Israel actually believes. I hope Israel understands that Iran probably already has the bomb and probably already has nuclear missiles. But if they don't, that's a very perilous situation, because Israel is pledged, and they, unlike us, they follow through and honor their pledges. They are pledged to stop Iran from getting the bomb. And if Israel thinks Iran is 10 weeks away from the bomb, you know, they might make some desperate military operation to try to stop Iran from getting the bomb that will light the nuclear match, you know, and Iran will.
Well, they've already talked about it.
Yeah, make an EMP attack on us. In other words, like a Balkan situation in 1914, except instead of the whole war starting with a single pistol shot into the chest of an archduke, it starts with the nuking of Israel and an EMP attack on the United States. You know, which that's just how perilous our times are, because of the technology that we live in and how quickly things can happen on an enormous scale. At least in World War I in 1914, it took weeks to mobilize armies, but things can move almost at the speed of light, you know, today with cyber warfare and EMP and that sort of thing. So here's just one example of where, you know, people wonder, well, so what if you have an intelligence failure? What can that matter? Well, these intelligence failures can make the matter between war and peace and the survival and death of Western civilization.
Bingo. So, Peter, a lot of people are going to be questioning. So, well, they want EMPs because they know we'll retaliate and we'll wipe them out and turn them into a plate of glass. But we may not know who to retaliate against, because something you and I have talked about in the past is that it's entirely possible that they could do a covert EMP strike on America. You were quite aware, and you hit it in your book, Blackout Wars, that the North Koreans had that tramp steamer, the Chung Chung gang, running around in the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico area, with two fully erect missile launchers with missiles in them that could have been sitting on the deck of the boat when it was running around in there. They wanted to go around the Horn of down in South America, but they, for some reason, they had to come through the Panama Canal. They covered it all up with a lot of sugar in the cargo hold and got caught with those things. So a scenario where somebody goes off the course of, say, unstable Venezuela, which just can't even control themselves, and launches at the United States, you don't know, was it North Korea? Was it China? Was it Russia? Or was it even Iran? I have heard from way back when the Soviet Union fell that Iran got two fully erect nuclear missiles from Kazakhstan. Now, whether that's true or not, I can't vouch for it, but that's what I was told by somebody that supposedly was in the know. So I didn't say that information from intelligence sources, so I'm not disclosing anything that violates anything that I saw. But that's the rumor I've heard. But so 4 different powers could do this. And how would you know who did it? How would you know who to retaliate? What would America do if somebody attacked us out of the Gulf of Mexico or out of the Caribbean Sea, off the coast of Venezuela, anywhere down there with an EMP weapon? We wouldn't see it coming because we're not looking in that direction. Suddenly our lights are out. Who do you blame? What do you do? Who do you retaliate? You know, they did it. They did it. Who did it? What's America do then?
Right. It could be by a terrorist group too, state-sponsored terrorist group. Iran's the world's leading sponsor of international terrorism. North Korea has threatened to sell nuclear weapons to terrorists. You know, so what if you're a terrorist group is doing the Scud in a tub scenario, doing an EMP attack off a freighter on behalf of some other country?
And Russia sells these missile launchers. And look, 20 years ago, Peter, I was out in the Gulf of, actually a little more than 20 years ago, 21, 22 years ago, I was in the Gulf of Mexico launching balloons that could easily carry a 300-pound package and better, and I could have geared up for more from a deck of boats and the Gulf of Mexico carrying rockets. That's what I was doing. This on a shoestring budget with a small crew operating out of a garage. And I did this more than once. So the technology that I was using could be employed by somebody to float a balloon over North America that could create an EMP with effective radius of at least, 300 kilometers. It would be quite an area of coverage. You could take a lot of, and if you put a rocket on there like I did and lofted it to a higher altitude, you could take it.
That would be enough. That would be enough. One of our scenarios.
And I was doing that as a amateur group, basically, in a small company I just spun off from over 20 years ago.
Yeah, you could put a meteorological balloon, which can lift a nuclear weapon to an altitude of 30 kilometers. That's the minimum altitude you need to do an EMP attack. That'll give you a footprint on the ground, 600 kilometers in radius.
Yeah, there you go.
You did that anywhere over the eastern coast of the United States.
30 kilometers. Yeah.
Industrialization, because it would cause the whole collapse of the whole eastern grid. And that's 75% of our population and 75% of our electricity is provided by the eastern grid. And we wouldn't be able to recover even from that scenario. And you could use a satellite, those North Korean satellites. There's hundreds of satellites in low Earth orbit. And the first thing that goes, when those satellites go off, when the EMP goes off, it propagates at the speed of light. And, so it can blind our ballistic missile early warning radars and our intelligence satellites, including the ground stations, at the speed of light. And that's how you know who attacked you. If you're blinded from the outset, you need that dual phenomenology in order to be able to ascertain, where's this attack coming from? Who did it? So you could use satellites also as a way of doing it and keep your and that's assuming that your retaliatory capabilities survive, which they may not, especially in the case of a super EMP weapon. Deterrence does not work if you don't know who attacked you, and if you are powerless to retaliate.
Bingo. Exactly. That's why an EMP attack could be so credible. That's why it is so probable in the military tensions. It's in the doctrine of all of our enemies that if we get into a war, that's the first thing they do.
Done in combination with cyber attacks on our military and civilian critical infrastructure systems as well. And attributing those who's doing the cyber is also extremely difficult. But yeah, that's another head in the sand thing, the word deterrence, okay? Because this is the simplistic, simple-minded, one-word, excuses that people come up with for saying, oh, that'll never happen. We don't have to worry about that because of something like deterrence. But they don't think, okay, that, every war that has ever been fought in human history is an example of deterrence failure. Okay? Deterrence has failed 100,000 times in the course of human history, and there's a lot more.
That's a good argument. Every war ever fought is a result of deterrence failure. Right. That's why we need deterrence. That's why we've got our way of dealing with China and their aggression they're having right now is deterrence. And also we need to take the fuel out of their tanks by quit trading with them, and which gives them the economy to operate the way they do.
That's why you've got to do more than deterrence. You've got to be able to fight, to actually do it if it comes.
Well, that is deterrence. That is deterrence.
The ability to fight contributes to deterrence. It makes you more credible. But you should never base all your hopes on the idea that deterrence is foolproof. And it is far from that. The experiences of the last century alone, the 20th century, we had 2 world wars, and that, and thank God, and that we didn't have a third, a Cold War. We nearly did. Deterrence almost failed despite all of our best efforts, during the years of the Cold War.
We had several instances that we almost had an accidental war when the only power we faced was Russia. Now we're facing Russia, we're facing China, and India faces Pakistan, India faces China, Israel faces Iran, Iran faces Israel. There are so many more prospects today for a nuclear war to get started.
Right, the pathways have multiplied greatly in terms of how you could get into a nuclear war, and the possibilities of nuclear conflict would not have been just accidental, during the Cold War. If Yuri Andropov, for example, I mean, they say, God looks after fools little children in the United States of America. All right. If Yuri Andropov had lived and not, died from kidney failure, he was probably going to launch. He was probably going to launch World War III before he died. And rolled the dice in the 1980s. And that's not the only episode where a deliberate nuclear war, could have happened, but it was just happenstance. Of this particular evil leader, dying out of good fortune, saved us.
We've had a lot of good fortune. We're here due to a long string of successive good fortunes. We've been playing Russian roulette, and then you think of all those near accidental wars that could have got launched. It's mind blowing when you just to consider that we've made it this far. We should be thankful. We need to figure out how to keep making it. I would say if we can deter China long enough, their demographics is going to go against them, and they're going to be a geriatric society, and then that threat will not be what it is today. At least their military adventurism should damp down. It doesn't mean that they won't have a lot of weapons sitting there that they could use, but at least the military adventurism should dampen down as society waxes geriatric, which we're expecting by the 2030s, maybe 2050s at the latest. And their goal is to take Taiwan by 2050. So if we can just keep them from it for a few decades, that might fizzle out. And there's our hope, is to provide sufficient deterrence to get through this. So I've got one final question for you. You may have some other points you want to make, but my big question is, we've got this thing fizzling with Iran right now. This could go, like you said, there may be a 10-week window there that we could be into a war with Iran. I don't know if that would I'm worried about it propagating into a full-blown world war, especially with China and North Korea seeing opportunities to move while if we get tied up with Iran. But if that don't happen in 10 weeks, realistically, what do you think we're looking at in terms of time frames of these things going south? Where's the real threats? How long do you think we have before it would go south if we don't do something more in the area of deterrence?
Well, it's hard to say. Okay, hard to say. One of the reasons I think we haven't been attacked so far is because of the election of Joe Biden, which has created many additional great strategic opportunities for our adversaries. If I was the Russian General Staff, I wouldn't want to go to war with the United States right now, because I'd want to wait and see, are we going to give up our ICBMs? Are we going to disarm the bomber force? These possibilities, which would make war winning so much easier for me, okay, and much more tempting, are great temptations. Don't forget Sun Tzu: the greatest victory is to win without war. Another thing that I find very worrisome, very depressing, it's on the positive side of avoiding nuclear war, but let's face it, there's rising authoritarianism and totalitarianism in our country. Are we still a constitutional republic? I would argue that we are not. Haven't been since President Trump got elected, because you have to have two political parties that respect the Constitution and the rule of law and believe in the peaceful transfer of power. And people, that our adversaries can see, that our own government is becoming like them. The FBI, the CIA, the definition of political adversaries as potential domestic violent extremists. The chief reason they would attack us is because of our freedom and because of the Constitution, because we represent an alternative system. All right. But if we become an authoritarian and eventually a totalitarian system, we will cease to be an existential threat to them in that respect. Now, I eventually believe that they would probably attack us anyway, eventually, because totalitarian states don't believe in coexistence even with each other. The Hitler-Stalin example that I mentioned earlier, both sides believe they eventually would have come to blows. The question is just when. But I think that China and Russia, if they decide that we're no longer a threat because we continue down this path of becoming an authoritarian and then a totalitarian system, while I think that would be a major factor delaying an attack on us, I think it would happen eventually. But I think there'd probably first be, suppose they get their way and they have this new world order. It's going to be dominated by Russia and China, and with their client states, North Korea and Iran. But we will not be the dominant power. We will be, basically sort of an isolationist power. Then they'll probably go to picnicking on each other. I would imagine a war between Russia and China seems most likely initially, and then whoever prevails over that, eventually they're going to come after us, someday. So that scenario, I mean, that could extend if the United States, unfortunately, does not become again a constitutional republic. I could see it go on for many years before we have to worry about an actual attack on the United States. But I'm at least equally concerned and more concerned that at some point, for example, Russia, the Russian economy, it's true, it's not much bigger than Venezuela's, and they have invested, massive, everything they've got in building up a war machine that could prevail in a World War III. That's not going to last. There's a window where that stuff is going to start becoming obsolete. So there's pressure on Russia, unlike China, that can take time. They've got a much better economy. There's pressure on Russia to act sooner rather than later, while they're strong. I think we've got, from a logical standpoint, I think we've got a couple of years, because the Biden administration is just so full of bad ideas that they want to see implemented on our side, in terms of the nuclear balance, in terms of our inability to deal with the cyber threats and EMP, that they're going to want to see how far. They're going to make some kind of a calculation about when we hit rock bottom. When they assess that we have hit rock bottom, then there's a very good chance that Russia or China or them together will decide to attack us when we've hit rock bottom, which is logically probably toward the end of the Biden administration. I imagine that every year that goes by, more and more damage is going to be done to us. Just look what they're doing to our military. Oh my God. I don't know if you saw, there was a video going around that compared recruiting for the Russian army with recruiting ads for the US Army. And it's the contrast, the political correctness, the brainwashing of our troops and everything. I mean, we're just undermining the morale of all of our best people and driving our best people out from the point of view of all of the bad guys. This is manna from heaven, and they want to see, take maximum advantage of that. But then, of course, Machiavelli said, half of history is just fortune. And so you can't really calculate these things. I mean, I can make a good case for something happening before the end, toward the end of the Biden administration from a logical standpoint. All right. I can make a case that if the Biden administration carries us further along the line toward totalitarianism, enough so that we're no longer feared as a free system, that it could actually go for years beyond the Biden administration before they attack us. But then there's accident, which does control at least half the events of history, where, and I'm very worried about that. like this thing we just talked about with Israel. You know, that within 70 days, does the Israeli government understand that Israel already is a nuclear weapon state, a nuclear missile state? If they don't understand that and they attack Iran, you know, we could get into a worst case scenario in the next 2 months or tomorrow. You know, it only takes like, you know, you talk about the accidents in the Cold War, you know, how we, you know, one of the most dangerous moments in the Cold War was on the 25th of January, 1995. You know, when they mistook a Norwegian meteorological rocket, the Russians mistook a Norwegian meteorological rocket for a US sub-launched ballistic missile that was making an EMP attack. The whole episode lasted only 20 minutes, but it was the closest we came to a nuclear war. It wasn't even the Cold War anymore.
Yeah, right. In fact, there was a Black Brant rocket.
Black Brant rocket.
Guys right. I knew up in Wallops, and some even here were involved in that rocket. Some guys even here in Huntsville had experiments on that rocket. So that was, you know, entirely experimental system. They notified the front desk there in Russia that they were going to launch it, but the guy did not send it back up to Russia. And Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin was president, Jimmy of Russia, and we had Clinton as president of the United States, and everybody thought we were all at peace and everything was lovely-dovey, and we came the closest to nuclear war that night than any time. That's right. You know, they all three of their Cheguts were activated. It was only Boris Yeltsin who couldn't believe that Clinton was going to attack. They were yelling at him to push the button. Right, yes. So we had an alcoholic, again, God protecting fools and little children in the United States. You know, this alcoholic, his two top generals yelling at him, push the button, but you know, he couldn't believe the United States was actually going to make a nuclear attack. And the alcoholic Boris Yeltsin saved the world by doing the right thing and not pushing the button. Something like that could happen tomorrow. And you just described the pathways. You know, it's not a bipolar world anymore in terms of these nuclear relationships and cyber relationships and all the rest. You know, I can imagine Iran wanting to concoct a nuclear war between the infidel powers, you know, and using cyber attacks or a nuclear weapon smuggled into a city or launched off a ship or something like that to try to convince the United States that we've been attacked by Russia or China. You know, these sorts of things could happen tomorrow, and this is the accident in history where it's so, you know, it's so unpredictable. Like so I can't plot from an old James Bond movie. 60s. Yeah, right. You know, and so at least half of human fate is due to fortune. So I could do all the calculations and all the rest, and say, well, we've got some time. We've got to the end of the Biden administration, but don't bank on that. You know, it could happen tomorrow. Right. Oh well. Yeah, I've got metrics to figure out myself. Like, you know, I've got 40 acres in Arizona. If it's going to happen tomorrow, I couldn't get the place up fast enough to save my life if it's going to happen with this Iranian thing. But if I've got 2024, I've got some luxury in how I set that up. So, you know, I'm having to make decisions myself right now as to what to prioritize. So, you know, I'm sure there's other people out there in the same bucket trying to figure, well, when do I do this? When do I do that? And you never can know for sure. You can only make your best judgment. And that's what I'm in the process of doing. But, you know, this is important to me to be able to figure out what to do. Because I do the prepping thing. I try to be ready for whatever may come, and I got some big decisions to make. And so I'm kind of beginning to bank on the idea that I've got a few years, and if I don't, there's not much I can do about it. If it's Iran that happens in the next 10 weeks, well, it is what it is. I just got to hunker down with what I got. But if I got a little planning time, I've got some margin. But you know, it may not be a lot. But you know, 3 years would be a lot for me. That would be plenty of time to set up what I need to set up. But you know, but then again, we just don't know. Like you said, it may be way beyond that. But sure. And who knows? They may take everything away from us and outlaw private property. There's a lot of people like to do that. But let's see them try it. You know, that's the mistake that we might want to hope that the powers that be make that mistake. You know, I think. Commenting on our internal domestic problem, you know, I think the
elites, our power elites in Washington, who want to take us in this direction of being a one-party system in an authoritarian, totalitarian state, and I am surprised and disappointed that the American people have been so passive in allowing their constitutional rights to be trampled, and that they've gone that far. But at some point, these people are, and it's right in your Constitution. Oh, as a matter of fact, I've got the Constitution too, and there's this passage. The founders were so brilliant to talk about predicting the future. They may have predicted the future again, right in the preamble of the Constitution, because prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Then they say, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for their future security. You know, we're suffering right now, and they haven't crossed the line, obviously, for the people yet, where we've decided that the despotism is becoming so absolute that it's intolerable. And when they do decide to take people's guns or force people, all the kids, to go to public school so they can be brainwashed into critical race theory and all these other, they actually try implementing that agenda and coming into our homes and doing that. That's where they will have crossed the line. And I think that the Second American Revolution can happen, probably peacefully. I mean, I think it's possible to have a peaceful Second American Revolution.
Oh yeah. I think
all the people have to do is say no.
bingo.
By their refusal, it looks like I've just been cut off here.
No, you're there. I was doing a screen share. That's
By
what
their refusal, because it's true that one of the other things in the Constitution is government is constituted among men, and it derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. If we refuse, the power elites in Washington think a lot the way the Soviets did, you know, and they think a lot of the way the Warsaw Pact dictators did. You know, they think that a nation is something that exists physically, that exists materially. And they think that they are physically in control of the nation because they control the levers of power at the top of government. Things like the FBI and the CIA and the IRS and all of that. They do not understand that a nation exists in the imagination of the people, and it's sustained only by the will of the people to agree to be governed by that state, you know, and in order to maintain that hold and continually be renewed in the mind of the people, it's got to be legitimate. That's what the Soviet power elite did not understand. And they were far smarter than our power elites. And they were the most sophisticated tyrants who have ever existed in history, equipped with the greatest apparatus for oppression that ever existed in history. And yet when they lost the legitimacy in the minds of their own people, and the USSR ceased to be legitimate in the minds of their own people, and the Warsaw Pact tyrannies ceased to be legitimate, it took only 2 years for them to disappear peacefully, largely bloodless revolution, and to be put on the ash heap of history. You know, I think a great illustration of this was actually recorded in Romania. Ceausescu, the moment of the revolution, happened when Ceausescu was giving another one of his long-winded 6-hour speeches. I guess he had returned from a trip to North Korea, and he was so impressed with how the North Korean people were so controlled that they were giving these, that they could be called out to give these elaborate demonstrations where they were coordinating their actions, and they were dressed in special clothing and things like that, paying tribute to the dear leader. And Ceausescu wanted to do the same thing in Romania. And in the middle of his speech, people finally had enough, and basically started yelling at him. And you could just see the look on his face. He couldn't comprehend this, that this was actually happening. And that was the beginning of the revolution in Romania. Now, Romania was one of the places where it was bloodier. But it was, hundreds of people, I think, fell. And it wasn't thousands or millions. And he was deposed and executed. I had the privilege, by the way, when I was on the House Armed Services Committee staff and representing them, and I went to Romania. I got to sleep in Ceausescu's bed. They rolled out the red carpet for me, so they put me up in Ceausescu's old palace, wow. and I actually slept in Ceausescu's bed. But Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden, they are stupid people, compared to the Soviet power elites. They do not have access to the oppressive instrumentation, FBI and CIA and IRS, although they can do bad things, they're not the KGB, they're not the MVD, they're pikers when it comes to the science and art of tyranny. I think I could easily see that same look on Ceausescu's face happening on the face of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and President Biden when they try to come into our homes and take our guns and brainwash our children, and people say, no, we're not doing that. No, we're not going to let you do that. We're not, and you know what else? We've gotten together, us 85 million people who voted for Trump, and we're not paying our taxes. We're not paying our taxes anymore until you guys do an investigation to prove that you were legitimate, that you actually won the election. And we're not paying our taxes until we have assurances, that the future elections are going to be free and fair and not stolen by you guys, so that we're going to have one election day, and you've got to have voter ID. It wouldn't be hard to have a second American Revolution that turns all this around. And maybe we get struck when we're starting to come back to a free system.
That's what I was showing you a minute ago. I just put on the screen my Freedom Restoration Foundation. I started about a year ago. We got people over we're a small group. We got people over the United States, and we do have a Facebook and a MeWe page, but we named the Freedom Restoration Foundation with the recognition that it's not about maintaining and preserving. We got to go backwards. We got to get the freedoms back that we had. And so we're working. We've got a board. We meet twice a month, every other week, basically. And, we're trying to get things done, but we're all volunteers and busy people. So, it's a lot of work to get this thing moving forward. But, that's one step. This is one group doing things and trying to make a difference. And we'll see what comes out. But we're actively working it, Peter. That's what I was trying to show you there. We've got a freedomrestorationfoundation.org, and you will see we've got an action center that gives you a lot of details about how to contact your state representatives, your federal representatives, what to do, what to say, how to call, how to email, how to track bills at the state level, at the federal level. So, and we got quite a resource center we put in there. Now, it needs regular updating, and it's a big chore for our small group to do that. But I think that it's one of the best sites out there for resources for what to do and how to go about it. So we're working this stuff, Peter.
Yeah, and here, I'm going to recommend 2 books. I've already recommended The Gathering Storm.
Okay.
So that people will know where we are in terms of our national security environment and World War III. Here's another good book to read in terms of the troubles we face domestically, our internal constitutional crisis. I'd recommend everybody read the Federalist Papers.
Mm.
I reread them recently. What an eye-opening experience. The great founders that I've always had such respect for, Alexander, Hamilton, Monroe, and Madison, to read through the Federalist Papers and see how these founders today have turned out to be wrong about everything. wrong about everything. Okay. The context is, they were trying to persuade the sovereign independent states in the aftermath of the revolution to move beyond the Confederation and become a federal form of government, a more centralized form of government, with a federal government for all the states in Washington, D.C. And the point of the Federalist Papers is to reassure the sovereign states that this will not become a tyranny. We obviously can't go through the whole thing, but every one of the major safeguards, basically they start off arguing, well, we won't become a tyranny. Don't worry about that, because the states are jealous of their sovereignty. And the states government, the states, either collectively or individually, will not allow the federal government, to exceed the powers that are specified in the Constitution. In the Constitution, the federal government's only supposed to have very limited powers. The states won't allow them to impinge on their sovereignty, because most government is supposed to happen at the local level. The people are supposed to rule themselves at the local level chiefly, and then above that, the state government has more, is the next level, but it's not supposed to be more powerful than the local government over people's lives. And then the weakest part of this system is supposed to be the federal government, that is only there to provide for interstate commerce and to provide for the common defense. So the states are supposed to be, one of the great obstacles. And you look at what the relationship is between the states today and the federal government, and obviously that barrier is no longer there. It's fallen. And they'll say, well, I actually kind of got this backwards. Within the federal government, you're going to have a Senate, and the Senate is not to be popularly elected the way the House of Representatives is. They're supposed to be appointed by the state legislatures and state governments to represent the state interests. So embedded right in the federal government, you're going to have this check on federal power in the Senate, which of course went away, in the Progressive era, when they very unwisely decided to overrule the founding fathers.
1913, they passed that and get rid of the Senate being appointed by the states. They passed the federal income tax and came up with the Federal Reserve System.
The income tax, okay?
All together.
The feds will not be able to have an income tax, because that would eat out the substance of the people and would provide a source of revenue that would give them tyrannical powers, to grow tyrannical powers if you allowed them to tax income, okay? Right? So that's not supposed to happen in the Federalist Papers in terms of the formula of how we remain a free people. And then the last thing is the Second Amendment, that there's a last resort if all these other checks and balances fail, that you've got an armed population, that is going to be the last bastion for freedom against tyranny, because the people themselves, will not tolerate, a tyranny in Washington, and will have another revolution if necessary to stop that tyranny from happening. And so it's really useful to read the Federalist Papers to see, because they are a kind of blueprint in reverse, all right, to see what we've got to get back to, how far we've got to get back. It's not like we're really close to getting back to where the founders intended us to be. We're actually more than a century away from where we're supposed to be. We've got to go back to before the Progressive era to get back to the kind of government that was envisioned in the Federalist Papers, so that we're really free, more free than we are today, so that we have more control over our income and more control over our systems of government at the local and state and federal level. It's really eye-opening to read the Federalist Papers from the perspective of today, to see how far we've drifted, and the failure of all these checks and balances. And this is not a criticism of the founding fathers. This is not a criticism of them. They were brilliant. They did the best they could. Even they realized that, tyranny cannot be held back by the best crafted Constitution.
They thought it would only last 50 years.
Right. One of the last checks I guess I should mention, even beyond the Second Amendment, was virtue. That's why they believed in public education and religion. Was important to a people. Because you cannot be free if the people do not have virtue. If the people are not, freedom they understood was hard work. It was that generation, politics was entertainment. They didn't have radios and TVs. One of the ways people recreated themselves was by paying close attention to political speeches and what the party platforms were, and people organized themselves into community groups, where they would talk about politics at the bar or at social gatherings and clubs, and they would talk politics, and that was part of their life, and it had to be, because freedom is hard work. You have to watch government and politicians like a hawk to see that they don't steal your freedom, and you have to have virtue. So you don't want to steal other people's property. So you believe in fair play, so you have Judeo-Christian values to have a just society. Those things have to be internalized in yourself.
Isn't income tax still on other people's property tax, income tax?
Right. And if you didn't have these virtues, I mean, the existence of that virtue was one of the final and most important check on government power. And alas, the corruption of our educational system, so that everybody is trained now to be a good little totalitarian Marxist, sexual pervert, climate change nut, is we may never be able to come back. I'm disappointed. It's frightening to me. I look at your white hair, white beard. Okay, my friend. Where are, the kids? That next generation. They should be in the streets. They should be protesting. They should be angry about the loss of their liberties and freedom. And if they had been inculcated with virtue, they would be. But unfortunately, our educational system has created a mindset among the young generation. I'm not saying all of them. I mean, my own kids, I'm sure they're in a minority, and it's actually such a small minority now that it's dangerous for them, to actually go out there and do the things that they're constitutionally able to do. So that's one of the things that really worries me, that we may not be able to turn things around. Ours is like the last generation that had any good grasp of what the real America is supposed to look like, and had the privilege of living in the last of what was the real America before we finally kind of crossed the line over these last 4 years into becoming no longer a constitutional republic, but right now we're a soft tyranny. They always start that way. Nazi Germany started that way, as a soft, with the best of intentions, making the railroads run on time, looking out for the workers and all that. It doesn't take long for them to turn into a hard totalitarian system.
We see the signs. It talks to social credit, many other things out there, Peter. The signs are there. Like for instance, this platform we're talking on, it's not a freedom of speech platform. I can't say anything I want to, especially when I'm talking topics like we do, the politics, the prepping. It's, the best analogy I've got is, this is like walking on eggshells on thin ice in an earthquake. So just, having a platform like this to talk. So, and
recording this, so you can delete as much of me as you need to.
I'm going to put it all up. I may lose my channel, but I'm going to put it up.
You can't afford to lose you.
It takes a lot of time to edit.
You are the modern equivalent of what the committees of correspondence were for the first American Revolution. It didn't happen overnight, the first American Revolution, and it didn't happen easily. It was like a decade of work by people who communicated with each other across the states about what was happening to us in the colonies. How are we losing our rights as Englishmen? You know, this is turning into a tyranny. What do we do about it? You know, the Second American Revolution was planned, and that's what we need to do. I mean, the first revolution.
First.
Right.
All righty, Peter, I really appreciate you. I think we need to go now. We've been going over 2.5 hours. If we go much further, it would be hard for people to want to watch the video. So I really appreciate everything you bring to the table here. You've been a real hero. You've been an advocate for freedom and preservation of our way of life here, and for moving us forward. But a lot of people just don't understand the subtleties, the arguments, and the positions. A lot of people don't understand the need for peace through strength, how that worked. You know, they forget the lessons of how that worked in the Reagan era, as opposed to the the Carter era before, and that we just lost a lot of that. But how we actually won the Cold War.
Right.
And then we look at these dangerous times, and yeah, I've been looking at this for some time, up the 30s. I mean, there's just too many parallels, and it is really frightening. And that suggests that we're in for really big trouble. It could be World War, and it could come fast. I don't know if it's going to be 10 weeks from now, 4 years from now, or as one of your articles suggested, maybe before 2032. So there's just a lot of questions out there. So I just want to tell everybody this: hope for the best, pray for the best, try to spread the word to preserve our freedoms and our way of life, but prepare for the worst, because it could get really bad really fast. A grid down situation is a horrible, catastrophic nightmare. We'll never fully recover in our lifetimes. I don't think we have a full-blown grid down with hundreds of these high voltage transformers fried. I don't know how you get back to replace it. It's like Humpty Dumpty falling off the wall. So you've been a real champion to get a grid hardened, and you've laid out a lot of good resources, like your Blackout War book, the many books you've written, the articles you write, your organization, and now I'm honored to be a state director in your organization for Alabama. So I hope
honored to have you aboard, sir.
And thank you. So, and I mentioned I just had an interview with John Hollerman yesterday, and I met him through another telecom that you're also participating in, that Secure the Grid group. So, and I tell people I'm involved in 2 separate national level committees working to get our grid hardened, and that's true. A lot of people think that I come here and talk prep and I'm just fear mongering. No, we're actually trying to make things better. We're trying to fix things, because we still have a glimmer of hope for the future, but it's not easy. But as long as I got a breath in my lungs, there's something to work for. Anyway, and you've been a bright star and leading this effort. So thank you, Peter. Thank you for coming on our channel. Any parting words?
No, just thank you so much for having me, and I would join you in urging your audience to be prepared. Be prepared.
I see you're in a log cabin there with an American flag behind you, so I can tell that one, you're a patriot, and it looks like you might be somewhere in the category of being ready.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, this is a 200-year-old log cabin that I'm, that I'm living in. It's not. It's located near the Spotsylvania battlefield, the great battlefields of the American Civil War. But in a very remote location. About 80 miles from Washington, D.C. So my family will, as the crow flies, so my family will be safe if Washington gets nuked. But it's still close enough so that I can drive into DC when I have to do my work. And you'll like to know this. Maybe I shouldn't mention it. But of all the people, there's a group of senior intelligence people I'll be briefing at the end of August, including the former Director of National Intelligence, General Clapper, one of our favorite people. And but it's not a bad sign that even people like him are interested in what I have to say about EMP. I won't be talking about the rest of what you and I have been talking about.
Probably get us on his blacklist, but that's all right. I've been on here making videos against Xi Jinping. I've called him a Hitler 2.0 and tried to warn the people of China that he's really failed. So I'm sure I'm not on his best friend list, if anything else.
Be prepared and read the Gathering Storm and the Federalist Papers, and my book, The Power and the Light. I'll throw that one in too.
All right. Peter, I think a good way to part this is to say, may your lights shine bright forever.
Thank you, my friend. Keep up the great work.
And thank you. And thank you everybody for watching this point. And I hope everybody has a blessed week. Thank you.